there's nothing more interesting, I think, to talk about what is dyslexia on the last day of a 3-day conference about dyslexia, because I know you haven't heard much about it before. Also, I think understanding the psychological report is probably at this point harder than understanding what dyslexia is. So we're going to take a look at it from some of the standpoints that you've heard before, and maybe put a little bit, hopefully a little bit of a spin on it, and hopefully bring it all together in a little bit of a nutshell. So the first thing we want to do, what happens when we ask people what is dyslexia? When you say to them, when you go into a classroom and you say to teachers or parents, and you say, what is dyslexia? And what do people say, mostly? Yeah, they see letters backwards. So that's probably the most prevalent idea of what dyslexia is, and some people have it and some people don't. So let's look at the first slide here, which is not there. And that's it, and there we go. One of the biggest misconceptions about dyslexia is that it is a reading problem. Dyslexia is a specific difficulty in dealing with language. It is a language disability, whether the language is expressive, it is receptive, it is in writing, it is in speaking. It has many facets to dyslexia. We're going to look at what dyslexia is, and this is what you've been hearing all week, so it's just, one thing about people who teach dyslexic children, we're nothing if we're not redundant. So we're going to say it again. Dyslexia is neurological in origin. It is difficulty understanding written and spoken language, difficulty expressing oneself clearly in speaking and writing, struggle in storing information, language information, and an inability to organize and retrieve internal information when needed. So I want to ask how many of you watch Jeopardy? Anybody watch Jeopardy? Anybody know the answers on Jeopardy? Then you don't need us here. But sometimes when I watch Jeopardy, and usually I try to answer when it's children's Jeopardy, but maybe I get one right. But what always impresses me, aside from the knowledge that these people have, is the speed at which they ring that buzzer. The retrieval process. And if you were to look in their brain, I would think that the wires and the neurons up there are very straight. They can find their way to whatever information they need. So when we talk to children, we talk to them and we tell them that sometimes you have a little cubby in school, and sometimes people have a cubby that's very nice and neat, and they have a pencil, and they have an eraser, and they have a piece of paper, and the teacher says, get a pencil. And guess what? They open their cubby and they get a pencil. And then you have our dyslexic friend next to them, and they open their cubby, and there's yesterday's lunch, and there's mittens that they lost last year, there's an old pair of sneakers, but somewhere in there, there's a pencil. So now how do they get to the pencil? How do you retrieve that quickly when needed? What do you have to do? You have to empty the cubby, throw things up in the air through that tangled mess, and try to get to the information as it is needed. So these are the kids that... Am I too close? Am I too loud? Okay, thank you. These are the children that you ask a question to, and they sit there and they look at you, and then you're 3 questions down the road and they have their hand up because they finally found it. So this is referred to also as a hidden handicap. These children don't come in on crutches with a broken foot. They present themselves as typical learners. They're bright, they're articulate. So when they don't know the answer, they have to not be trying, right? They have to be a little lazy. They could do it if they wanted to. That's our perception of dyslexia. It is an unexpected gap between a student's potential to learn and their academic achievement. Dyslexia is on a spectrum. There are no 2 dyslexics that are alike, and each have individual strengths and weaknesses. That's why it is so difficult to teach dyslexics from a program. It is difficult to do it from a page turner where page 1, page 2, page 3, because none of these students are alike. They have difficulty with reading, spelling, expressive language, speaking clearly, writing, sequencing, or time projects. Anything that has to do with sequencing, whether it be sounds, syllables, or order of operations causes them problems. So you have these little kids and they come into school the first day of school and you tell them, I want you to hang your coat in the closet, I want you to put your homework on my desk, and I want you to put your lunch in the cubby. And it's June and the lunch is on your desk and the coat is somewhere on the floor and they have no idea of how to do 1, 2, 3. And that pervades most things that they do. Their handwriting sometimes is very good, sometimes it's totally illegible. And many of them have attention deficit problems. There's ADD and ADHD, and there's also an attention deficit that comes from having no idea of what's going on in the room. So if I have no idea what you're doing and I can't read what you put in front of me, I could just kick the guy next to me because that looks like fun, right? And there we have our behavioral problems that come from not knowing what to do. Individuals with dyslexia often have a wide range of talents. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but they're out-of-the-box thinkers. Many of them are good with their hands, they're good with art, they're good with music, but academics, not so much. But they commonly have an average or above average IQ. Why do we focus on dyslexia? Why are there 2,000 people here today trying to learn? Why are we trying to help these children? Because statistically, 70 to 80% of people with poor reading skills are likely dyslexic. 80% of children with an IEP have reading difficulty, and 85% of those are dyslexic. 1 in 5, or 15% of the population, has a language-based learning disability, and dyslexia is the most prevalent language disability. According to the National Assessment of Educational Progress, almost 40% of our students are deficient have not reached proficiency by 4th grade. That's here in the United States. 40% of our students have not reached proficiency in 4th grade. Nationwide, 20% of elementary school population is struggling with reading. 20 to 25% of all adults can only read at the lowest level. And 62% of non-readers dropped out of high school. So there we have a social problem with work and everything else. And if you believe the papers that the jails for the next 15 to 20 years are based on the results of the 3rd and 4th grade reading test. So that kind of gives you an idea of why we need to help these children. What dyslexia is not. It is not a sign of low intelligence, and amazingly, I have 6 children of my own, and I've stood on the corner with mothers for many a year, and it's very hard for them to, if your children happen to be in a gifted program, and you'll hear, they're in a gifted program, they can't read. What are they doing in a gifted program? Right? Sometimes teachers are saying, what are they doing in my classroom? They can't read, but they can think. So while we say it's not a sign of low intelligence, I don't know how many people really believe it. It is not a result of laziness or not caring. It is not a disease. It is not an eye problem. It is not just reversals of letters and numbers, and it can't be cured with pills and diets and colored lens and medical treatment. It is the only medically diagnosed disability that is educationally remediated. So this is a spotlight on why, this little ant is going to be not going to be happy that he couldn't read that box in a few minutes. And I personally had a woman come into me in Walgreen and come over with a box of Tylenol and say to me, can you tell me if this is children's Tylenol because they changed the box? All right? So when you get out there, there's a whole world of literacy that we have to survive in. These are the slides that I think you've seen many times. I think this is based on the work of Sally Shaywitz. And we have the word form area that the doctor talked, I'm not even going to try to say his name again, that we talked about yesterday. And you can see that in the left hemisphere of the brain in typically developing readers, that all the activity for word form and language and reading is based in that center. If you look at dyslexia, a dyslexic brain, there is not that much activity or any going on there. I'm sure there's more than they show there, but not what they need. So it is misdirected, all right? So what happens with kids? How do you say that to kids? So I tell children, suppose I want to hang a picture, and I get 2 nails, and I get a hammer, and I give you a feather. We go up to the wall, and we start to bang it in. You know, I'm there with my hammer, I'm banging it in, and you're there with your feather going nowhere. The nail is dropping on the floor, I'm banging in, my picture's up on the wall, and where is yours? Who's going to get disgusted? Who's going to try harder? Who's going to keep trying? Are you going to keep trying? How long are you going to try with the feather? Why? Because I'm smarter than you? Am I smarter? I'm using the right tool. And what happens here is they're not using the right tool. That frontal lobe does not identify letters. It does not blend sounds. It does not do the things that they need to do when reading. So what do we have to do as educators is we have to build the network that's not in place. And that's what we do with multisensory teaching. So when we talk about making these connections, you heard yesterday that reading is not a natural process. Half of the world doesn't do it, and they lead perfectly happy lives if literacy is not a big component of their society. But we have to go from seamlessly through this process in about an nanosecond. So what you have to do first is the reader has to identify the letter. So when you see an H on a page, you have to identify that as a letter. If it has no sound, it means nothing. So now you have to get the sound in there. Then you have to go to the next step. You have to log into the phonological processor. You have to make that connection. The phonological process has to take those symbols, turn them into sounds, and then blend them into words. And then you have to know what the word is. All right? You have to know what a hat is, otherwise you have a word and you have no idea what it means anyway. So all of those things have to come together like that. Because if I were to show you a word, I don't have anything to write on up here, but if I wrote the word cat down and just unveiled it to you, how long would it take you to read it and see a little animal that scratches your furniture? How long? About a second? Not a second, not even a second. That's how fast you have to read to be a fluent reader. This is the language triangle, and these are the connections that have to be made. And so we have the visual, we have the auditory, the kinesthetic, and the tactile all have to come together. And if you look between the visual and the auditory, that is where there is a break. What we see, what the students see visually does not connect to the auditory processor. So what it is a neurological break in the phonological loop. So when we do multisensory teaching, we build that triangle again. Okay, that's what we have to do. The way we have to do it with a child is the same way we have to do it with a teacher. When we train teachers, we have to rewire their brains to look at language differently. And sometimes it's harder to rewire their brains than it is to rewire children's brains. Okay, this is Scarborough's rope. And this was put together, and when you look at it, you really wonder why, how any of us read. But when those wires are doing what they're supposed to do, when the connections are being made very seamlessly, you will read without any effort, seemingly without any effort. But when they're not, there's big problems. So where do I get the most bang for my buck? Over here is decoding, because if I can't decode, I can't do anything. I need phonological awareness. I have to have that understanding that spoken language is made up of individual sounds. And then I need a sight vocabulary, because approximately 15% of the English language is not regular and needs to be memorized. After that, I need background knowledge. I need vocabulary. I need language structure. I have to know semantics and how to place language. I need verbal reasoning, inference, metaphors, and I need literacy knowledge. And if you look at Scarborough's rope, it's a braid. You don't have reading and writing and spelling. They braid together. They have to come together in one unit in order for students to read and understand. So I had an assistant principal bring over, I was working in a school, and he came over and he said to me, I'm doing comprehension for the 4th grade reading test. And he said, I want to look at these strategies. What do you think of the strategies? I said, they're good strategies. I said, can they read the text? He said, not really. Now, you know, that's kind of a, okay, let's go to the next slide. Oh, bad. Okay, all right, sorry. Now I need some volunteers. Do I have some volunteers? Could I have 5 people who have who are good sports? Who do we have 5 good sports? One? Up here?
2. You got 2.
I'm going to take this. I'm going to come down.
Yeah. The guy over there on the front side.
1. Do I have 2? Can I hear 2? Come on up 2. Come on up 3. 4, 5.
And
Okay. Where's
the
my
guy? The guy on the front row.
You know, I'm sorry. What?
The guy on the front row can't volunteer.
Oh, we have 5. Where's my clicker? You know what? I didn't bring down the paper for everybody. Is the clicker up there? I left my papers for all of you upstairs. So I wanted you to turn around, and I want you to look at the board, and just move back a little bit. Your name is?
Shauna, Dana, Grace, Rachel.
Well, I don't know why I did that, because I'm going to have absolutely no idea what your names are. So I'm just going to point and say, hey, you. But who would like to read our instructions for our little story? Oh. No, wait, I missed. Got to go back. There we go. Start at the beginning. Could you please read the instructions for me? Look at the letters. Get your mouth in ready. Sound it out. Look for the little word and the big word. Today, excuse me, what was your name? Shauna, we're waiting, Shauna. We have 5 people to go through. Did you study that? That was one of your words last night. Did you do your homework? You know, I had this problem with you, Shauna, last time. What is your name? Dana. Dana, could you pick it up? Did you study, Dana? I don't think so. I don't know what happened here. Come on, read from the beginning, please. Well, do you remember? Can you have a good memory? Because you know, repeated reading helps a lot. So could you read? No. Let's not find the something. Look at the letters. Look at the letters. Look at that. Get your mouth ready. Look at the picture and guess. Take a guess. Every year I get this kind of class. They give it to me every year. Every year. Could you do it? Could you read it, please? No. You come here. You come here. I want you to read that for me. These are all, excuse me, these are your sight words from last night. Did you study? Did anyone here study? The whole class is waiting. We have to go to lunch. Excuse me. Oh, dear. Oh, my God. I have the pains in my head. Do it again. Find the name of someone who is... Oh, my goodness gracious me. Where is my special ed teacher? Go, read. Do you see what happens? Excuse me. Ladies, do you see what happens when you study? Do you see what happens when you do your homework?
That's what we said.
Find the name of someone who is wearing blue. Last one. Read the next sentence. Today, please. Over age 21. Good. Next one. Go. Taller than 5 feet. All right, give these ladies a hand. Give these ladies a hand. Before you sit down, ladies, where's Shauna? Where's my first? How does it feel? How long does it take you to be embarrassed? How long does it take you to lose self-esteem? How long did it take you before you kicked her for getting you up here? Okay, that's how children feel every day for 12 years. Right? They do not have to be made to read in front of their peers. They can read at your desk. They can read with a para. They do not have to be humiliated. Okay? Let me ask you, Shauna, why didn't you try harder? Why didn't you try harder?
Well, actually, I was waiting to see if somebody else would give me a letter that I...
Who's the lady who was next to you? Did you try hard? Yeah. Did it make a difference? No. Were you lazy? I think you're smart. So maybe if you just tried harder, you could do it. And that's what we say to kids. We know you're smart. If you tried harder, you could do it. How many of you out there could do it? All right? Remember how it feels. So I am an Orton-Gillingham practitioner. I'm a fellow of the Academy of Orton-Gillingham Practitioners and Educators. And I think we would be remiss not to talk about Orton-Gillingham, since the history of dyslexia parallels the history of the Orton-Gillingham approach. We know who Dr. Orton is. And in 1925, or thereabouts, he published his first paper in the United States on streptosymbolia, and he modeled the evolution of dyslexia. After his death, the Orton Society was instituted, which has grown into this organization that we have today. So Orton-Gillingham and the International Dyslexia Association are extremely closely integrated. I'm just going to give you a couple of things about how many of you are Orton practitioners here? Okay, so you know a lot about this. So it's an instructional approach to learning. It is not a program. It is not something that we do as a page turner. It is an approach to language. I'm going to skip down to number 3, and this is very important. In the hands of well-trained and experienced instructors, it is a powerful tool of exceptional breadth, depth, and flexibility. And the optimum sentence there is in the hands of a well-trained, experienced instructor. The Academy says it takes 3 years to understand it yourself so that you own the material, so that you understand how to manipulate the material. If you cannot manipulate something, it is not a usable tool. If you have to go from 1 to 2 to 3 as an instructor, it is not usable for you because the child in front of you probably does not go from 1 to 2 to 3. So this takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of work, and it takes experience. It is often associated with one-on-one tutoring. That's how it began, but it is highly effective in the classroom. I'm from New York, and I do extensive training in the New York public schools, and we do it in classrooms of, 32, 28, and in classrooms where 75% of the children speak no English. And it is highly effective with ELS. How many of you took a language in high school? Spanish, French, something? You learned the structure of Spanish. You learned how to conjugate a verb in Spanish. You learned vocabulary, but you learned everything else. English is the only language where we don't teach structure. These are the characteristics of the Orton-Gillingham approach. They're personalized, they're multisensory, they're diagnostic, prescriptive, systematic, structured, sequential, cognitive, and emotionally sound. They're emotionally sound because we only put in front of a child what we've taught them. Now, when you say this in a classroom, people are like, what do you mean? I only taught 10 letters. How could I only put 10 letters in front of a child? But if you were a math teacher, and you went in and you taught addition, and you gave homework in square root or algebra, you'd get fired. If you were a history teacher and you taught World War II, and you decided to give a test on, the Spanish Revolution, you would be fired. But if you teach you can give a book that says, yesterday at Muriel's party, she sat on a mat, and never have taught one thing except So what we put in front of a child is what we have taught them, which makes them succeed, which is why it is emotionally sound. This is just a quote from The Many Faces of Dyslexia. The differences are personal, the diagnosis is clinical, the treatment is educational, and the understanding is scientific. The Orton-Gillingham approach serves the united whole. In a nutshell, when people say to me, what is Orton-Gillingham? What are you teaching? What are we learning? I am teaching you the structural base of the language that you speak. That's what it is. And the English language is not crazy. It is a beautiful language that is fully 85% rule and pattern based. That means on an intellectual level, I can teach you how to figure out 8.5 out of every 10 words. 15% of the language has to be memorized. 8.5 words out of 10, you're literate. It is teaching the language the way it is to the students the way we are. So that is what Orton-Gillingham is. And now I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Fedora, and then you're going to see this is what dyslexia is. This is how we remediate it. But when you get that report, what does it say? Okay, thank you.
You got the clicker? Okay. All right, so does everyone have a handout? There are handouts in the front chairs here. There may be some in a seat further back. You really need the handout. So if you don't have one, please come up and get it. So I'm assuming some of you are teachers and you got reports that you have to read, or some of you are parents. Anybody parents? Okay. And teachers? Okay. So when you look at a psychological report, and sometimes you get a really good one and there's lots of information. Sometimes you got one that's not so good, so it doesn't tell you too much. But when you get a report and it's in your hands and you're looking at it and you come to a page that has lots of charts and tables and numbers, what do? Somebody that's had a report, what do?
I always wonder, I'm an administrator, so I'm not on the front lines of these reports, but I always wonder why the numbers are incomprehensible to anyone who's a layperson, whereas I just wonder why it has to be that way.
Well, I wondered that too, because I read lots of reports. I worked in schools where I had to read the reports. It was private schools for children with dyslexia. And I got to the pages with the numbers, my eyes crossed, and I flipped to the next page. So they weren't meaningful to me. But over the years, I had to read lots and lots of reports. I finally went back to get a Ph.D. because I was in an Orton-Gillingham school, and I said, wow, people need to know this. Kids need to learn how to read, and they weren't learning the way I had been taught in my master's program. So the more I've worked with it, I just started thinking about what can I do to help people understand this a little bit more. The numbers are very meaningful. So your handout is kind of crunched down. I typically do this in a longer presentation. What we're doing here is just, I'm trying to help you understand what's in the handout. Hopefully it will be helpful for you. So the purpose that I put this together is sort of to give you more information so that you're an informed reader when you look at the report, and also to supplement the information that you find in the report. I have 5 children, and actually all 5 fall under the special education umbrella, so I've had lots of reports that I had to read. And some of them were 30 pages long and gave me lots of good information. I've also had reports that were 5 pages and really told me nothing. There is a lot of information in a psychological report in those numbers that you can pull out, even if it's not written in the report. So that is sort of the purpose for my part of this session. Okay, so this is just sort of an overview, and for the purposes of this session, I'm using the WISC-V because that's your primary entry level. If they're having a neuropsych or a school psychologist is doing a report, you may see a full battery of tests. The scores that we're going to talk about today are standardized, so the numbers would mean the same whether it's the WISC or the Woodcock-Johnson or some other norm referenced assessment. Okay. So in your handout, we're looking again at the WISC-V, just to use that as a model. So you have a brief description of what the different index scores are talking about. You also have a section that says low scores may be an indication of. Actually, performance influenced by I did take out, so I apologize. I forgot to pull that out of here. But I have provided some suggestions for activities or things that you could do in the classroom if you see an area of weakness and the child needs some support, and also if you see strengths. So you want to look for strengths and weaknesses when you read the report. At the very end of your handout, you have a page that says red flags. And probably if you have a report you're reading, this may be of interest, so we are going to talk about that. It's just giving you, where you would look if the child has a fluency problem or a word reading problem. Which scores, would you look to see if it's low, and what would be some of the issues there? All right, so the WISC-V. Anybody still seeing the WISC-4? Is everybody seeing WISC-V? Yes, no? So their new reports with WISC-4? Yeah. Mm-hmm. You still see them. I'm not certain why, but you might. But most likely, I think you'll just see the WISC-V going forward.
Does it matter if it's hearing specifically, like you had a child in first grade or second grade, and then you have another IQ test in first grade, so one to five? One reason I can think of is maybe people want to.
Well, they're different. So the WISC-4 had 4 index scores to calculate full-scale IQ. The WISC-V has 5. But the WISC-V has a new framework. So previously for the WISC-4, if you just look at that top box, that was it. So for the WISC-V, they're trying to help us identify kids with learning disabilities and other, cognitive weaknesses. So the ancillary, the third box down, those are new scores that are really focused on kids with learning disabilities and sort of pinpointing the different learning disabilities more precisely. But we're going to look at each one of these. This is just the total framework. So for the 5, there are 5 index scores. There's 3 levels of scores. So the full-scale IQ is calculated using 7 subtests. So the ones with the check marks are the ones that are used for the full-scale IQ. So you have a verbal comprehension index, visual spatial index, fluid reasoning index, working memory index, and processing speed index. So when I talk about index scores, those are the indexes. We're also going to talk about the subtests, which are the ones that are underneath. You can see a report that just has the top 2 of each of those, but you may also see a report that has the bottom, like information and comprehension, where it's in italics. Those may or may not be on there. A very thorough report should give you all of those, because there's information that's helpful in supplementing the other information in the report, even though it's not part of the full-scale IQ. And I think you can't see my blue in the new terminology at the bottom. So the primary scores are the ones that are in blue. And those are the ones that are used to calculate full-scale IQ. One thing that's interesting, prior to this, there were no substitutions. With the WISC-V, the psychologist can choose to substitute. So if you were expecting to see those 7 and you looked at the report and 1 was missing, don't be alarmed, because you have this information. These are the allowable substitutions. So if we just look at similarities, everybody see that at the top? We can go back. So similarities is under verbal comprehension, but information and comprehension could be substituted. So you wouldn't see similarities, but you would see one of those others. Clear? One thing to remember is if they've substituted in similarities, then that's it. One substitution for the entire test. They don't have to substitute, but they can. If you saw a test where they had substituted more than one, I would question it, because now you're introducing error, and it's really not allowed for them to do more than one. We don't want error. We don't want measurement error, because then our scores aren't valid. Okay. So moving down to the ancillary index scales. And as I said, these are primarily used to look at the processes related to learning difficulties. If we had time, I would make you sort of move the tests around, because all of these came from the first level of scores, but they shifted them around, so they're in different places. And so now we have new index scores. So the QRI is the Qualitative Reasoning Index. Auditory Working Memory is, AWMI Index. Nonverbal Index, General Ability Index, and Cognitive Proficiency Index. So with the WISC-IV, if you're still seeing that, if there were issues with any of the index scores, there was a large discrepancy, you might have seen a report that didn't tell you the full scale IQ or said that it wasn't a unitary construct, and they would have reported a general ability index score. That's automatic with the WISC-V. I'm not seeing reports that actually talk so much about the ancillary. Those of you who have seen a WISC-V, are you seeing that part discussed? You are? Okay. So that's good. They should be talking about it. Okay. So the complementary index scales are more of the cognitive processes. And again, these are new index scales and subtest scores that they put together, looking at naming speed and retrieval. So these are cognitive processes. So to go back just for a minute, the general ability, if that was calculated, what they did for that was they took out working memory and processing speed. So they only looked at the cognitive processes to get that score. Okay. So for the WISC-V, there are new descriptive classifications. The score ranges are the same, and the percentiles are the same. And they've mainly changed the bottom, extremely high, very high, or very low, extremely low. So very low used to be borderline. To me, that was very descriptive. It was easy to understand. Okay. So I wanted to go over just the different types of numbers, because this also was something that confused me. So the IQ, full scale IQ, and the index scores are standard scores. And they're written with capital SS. Mean is 100, standard deviation is 15. So they typically range from 40 to 160. You see reports of people that have like 200 IQ, and so I'm assuming, they can go up higher, but this is the typical range for what you would see. The subtests, the ones that are under the index scores, are scale scores. They also are abbreviated SS, but they're lowercase. Has anyone ever seen them mixed up? Or maybe you didn't look at the numbers. I've actually seen them mixed up. which is potentially confusing also. The difference is the mean is 100 on the standard score. For the subtest score, the mean is 10. Subtest scores, scale scores, range from 1 to 19. So you might see they're saying it's a standard score and it's 10. So that should say, oh, well, this must be a typo because you can't have a standard score that's that low. A scale score. Percentiles most people are pretty clear on. They range from the first percentile to the 99.9th percentile, 50s being average. So a person who scores at the 75th percentile scores as well as or better than 75% of the students in that age or grade group. Okay. So if we want to start interpreting, the first thing you want to do is look at that full scale IQ and determine if it's a unitary construct. Can it be used to determine eligibility for special education services? It was easier to do with the WISC-IV because it was 1.5 standard deviations, the discrepancy. And we're going to look at some numbers so that makes more sense. So this is looking at scatter when we look at the discrepancies. Is scatter a term that you're familiar with? No? So scatter just means you've got highs and you've got lows. So the kids we work with tend to have some high scores and some low scores. High scores are their strengths, the low scores are their weaknesses. When we see a big discrepancy, though, that's kind of a red flag. You know, what's going on? That's much harder to determine with the WISC-V because the mean is determined based on each child now, so it's not standardized. But I left this in because I think it's a good red flag. If you see, 1.5 standard deviation difference between those index scores, then you want to look for a discussion of that. Why was there such a discrepancy? So that again is what I was just saying, looking at the index level strengths and weaknesses, and maybe if you look at your handout so we can make this a little more concrete. On page 7 you should have a table. Everyone see the table on page 7? So full scale IQ for this person is 85. Verbal comprehension is 65. Does everybody see that? Okay. Visual spatial 102. Fluid reasoning 103. Working memory 91. And processing speed 108. So the 65, 102, 103, 91, and 108 were used to calculate the full scale IQ of 85. If we don't look at the 85 because we've already calculated that. If we look at the other index scores, what's your highest score? What's the highest score? 108 is the highest. What's the lowest index score? Okay. What's the difference between those? 43 points. That's a big discrepancy. So the psychologist should be talking about that in the report. But that's a serious red flag. But that would be where you would want to look and just see, what are the highs, what are the lows. If I see something like this and I don't find a discussion in the report, I can take the handout and go back and look to see, what is this an indication of. So let's flip over. So she's low in verbal comprehension. So if you come back to the first page where you see verbal comprehension. Okay. So take a minute and just look at this section. read over it, and then I'm going to ask you to maybe talk to a partner and see, what information did you get from this that might be helpful. So, and definitely in a full battery, you're going to have lots of other scores, or you should. But we want to start here to see where the red flags are. So, this low score should lead the psychologist to do other assessments that would dig a little deeper into this. Does that make sense? So one thing to think about when you look at these scores, because all of her other scores are high, her full scale IQ is not so high though. This is pulling it down. So this is a child also that may be a lot brighter than she appears on paper. And you want to keep that in mind. A test is like a snapshot. So know the student, know the child, and understand, what are their test-taking skills and other things. But that score is what's pulling her full-scale IQ down. So we can't assume that she's that low necessarily. She could be very bright, but just having difficulty showing it. All right. So we also want to look at the ancillary scores. And so I put this example in here so you would see ancillary scores. Now those are a little bit easier because we can have scatter everywhere. So there can be scatter in the subtest, and that's pretty definitive. Remember, they range from 1 to 19. So if you see more than a 5-point spread within an index score, that's going to knock that index score out. So I have an example just so you could see. If you see visual spatial here, and there's no score, does everyone see that? It's not in your handout because I just put the slide in this morning. So why is that there? Why isn't there a score? I can hear somebody saying the right answer, but I can't. Yes. So there was more than a 5-point spread. And so in this report, they're telling you that we couldn't use the score. It's really not valid. You might see that. And then again, you might not. So, okay. All right, so looking at the WISC-V and just identifying kids with disabilities, if you would flip over to the red flags on page 6. So for the first one, I'm just showing you what it would look like. You have a whole page with the different areas of strengths and weaknesses. But for each one, you're going to have index scores that might be low. So for a word reading problem, you might see a low VCI or an auditory working memory index in the ancillary. For subtests, you might see low digit span, vocabulary, information, or comprehension. So you could go and look at those, and if one of those areas was low, then your handout should be able to give you some suggestions for low digit span or vocabulary. What I had to take out to make this a little bit shorter were the scores that are supplemental, so the ones that are in brackets. But you would have digit span and vocabulary. And the complementary measures, delayed symbol translation and naming speed literacy. So those would be areas where you might look to see if the child has weaknesses there. We also have pseudo-word decoding, reading comprehension, oral reading fluency, basic reading and total reading. So what I would like for you to do is, again, work with someone in your area, a partner. Look at the scores that you have an example of. And think about Katie and where her strengths and weaknesses are. And then look through your handout and see, what would be something you could do to help her or something you could suggest to the teacher. Let's just quickly, these are just some quotes, but I wanted to bring it in simply because it ties in nicely with what Anne talked about. Down at the bottom, children with reading disorders perform poorly on verbal learning measures and on paired associate learning tasks that involve pairing a visual input with a verbal response. So that's that sound symbol, like when she talked about the hat. You have to see the word and be able to pair it with your lexicon, with the knowledge that you have for that word, and also an image of, what a hat is, to pull all those pieces together. So if we have questions, since we're right on time to end, yes. Well, yes, that's what this is. This is the IQ test.
So how, it would seem to me that a dyslexic would probably score low on some of these tests.
Mm-hmm.
And if a dyslexic scores low on these tests, then that IQ score will be impacted by that dyslexia.
Exactly.
And you end up with an IQ score that is lower due to the dyslexia. But we're saying dyslexia has no bearing on intelligence. So I'm trying to understand how, this is a completely layperson kind of question, but where does one parse out the dyslexia and intelligence? I mean, even, we wouldn't even say somebody with low working memory is necessarily not intelligent.
Right, and typically for kids with dyslexia, you see low processing speed and low working memory. Those are sort of the...
So how do you say that dyslexia, and by the way, I couldn't believe it more. My son's dyslexic. He's really, really smart, but he can't read.
Mm-hmm.
Like he's really struggling.
Mm-hmm.
But what do I do with this test when clearly the dyslexia and the learning disabilities are impacting the scores, which purport to measure intelligence, and yet we say has no bearing? I'm just lost on that one.
That's a good question. So certainly the psychologist should be able to identify that the child does have dyslexia.
But how do you
and
intelligence through this test? Is it the discrepancies?
I think the fact that they're identified as a child with dyslexia, so working with people who understand that, they should know, or what they should know and what they actually project to the child in the classroom, if it's the teacher, may be two different things, because we do tend to, like Anne did, treat kids like they're lazy and like they're not trying. When they're actually trying very hard, they're probably trying harder than their peers, but they're not trying smart. They haven't found the way that's effective and works for them. Yeah.
Does this strike you as a child with dyslexia? This profile here?
The fact that her verbal is so low is certainly a red flag. These are scores from Pearson, so they're not necessarily identified as a child with dyslexia. But that's certainly a red flag. That's a very low score on the verbal comprehension. So it certainly says that she's having trouble with language. If you look on the back, I wrote just a little summary of what this is telling us. So, I wouldn't, this says her IQ is 85. I would question it, because she's got this one low score that's really pulling it down. And the IQ is the average of these index scores. So a psychologist all of that should be coming out in the report. I don't think I've ever seen a report where they ever sort of addressed this child has dyslexia, and therefore we can't put 100% faith in the score, so we don't want to use this score to represent the child.
I think I've seen them say the test is questionable due to.
So if there is that scatter, that discrepancy, they should say that. But not, yes, I have seen them, but more often than not, I've just seen that they aren't mentioned. Yeah.
The question you were asking about intelligence related to this test, what I heard described once was our IQ test is reflective of our culture. And our culture has put the priority on vocabulary. This is a language-based intelligence measuring test. So in our culture, we're testing that part of the brain that holds this language and saying, this says if you're smart or not. I saw one time a test used on Aboriginal children where they put rocks on a tabletop, and because the Aboriginal children were scoring low in intelligence, yet they knew they weren't low in intelligence. But when they moved the rocks around, the Aboriginal children could put the rocks back. The other children who were scoring high on IQ could not put them. They didn't even know the rocks had been moved. So if that culture, our culture, looked at that as a measure of intelligence, it would prioritize those people with that skill to show high ability. So this is reflective of a world based on language in a world with people who have very unique skills that aren't being captured in these tests. And that is hard to explain to teachers in schools, I think, that don't understand that the test itself is biased. So that's why I just wanted to get to that.
And that's an excellent point, that the test essentially is biased. And if you do much testing, you actually can see that there are tests that are biased. I work with testing in the schools in New York, and there's some that I know those kids just don't know the answers because of their cultural background. So I think hand back there, and then I'll come back. Yeah. Well, working memory and processing speed are part of they can't calculate the full scale IQ without those. I mean, I would question the validity if they're not. As you start looking at reports, you can see all sorts of things. And that was one reason I started putting this presentation together also, because I read reports that I now could read and say, wait a minute, this isn't right. You're not telling me what the numbers are actually saying. So you really want to read with a critical eye and be an informed consumer of the report. And if it's not telling you what the numbers say are there, I'd go back to the psychologist. And I did, and I know we're over time, but I had a teacher send me a report one time a couple of years ago, and she said, I don't understand what's in this report. Can you help me? And I looked at it, and I talked with her, and I said, there's a huge discrepancy here. But the child did not have any kind of learning disability label. And so she was tutoring. She asked the mother, may I talk to the psychologist? Mother said yes. The psychologist said, the mother did not want me to say anything, but I hoped that someone would notice. None of the teachers noticed, no one noticed. So when they go to private, the parents are paying, and it seems a little unethical. I can't speak to that. But that was sort of a shock that the mother didn't want us to say anything, and I hope someone would notice. So was the tutor that actually noticed that there was a problem, but the teachers didn't. But a lot of teachers in public schools don't actually read them, I don't think. Okay. Any other questions? So I think that's it. Thank you for coming. Thank you for persevering to the end of the conference.